So my next question is also regards a little bit President Biden, his recent remarks about Taiwan, that he has a commitment, he will defend it. So my question is, the Chinese Air Force interferes in the Taiwanese ADIZ nonstop. So I'm thinking, let's say there is another commitment remark from President Biden. How could the Chinese Air Force escalate it? Because even the Global Times said it, that the next step would be a Chinese jet flying over the island or something like that. They might do it, okay? So what is the procedure then from Taiwan? How do you think would they handle it? Or what's the likelihood that it could happen from the Chinese side?
So, yeah, that's a good question. And to add to what you just described, we just got in last night, the PRC Ministry of Defense spokesman said something to the effect of, what median line, what center line? There is no center line between China and the PRC. So for 50 years, that line, the halfway
Yes.
between the mainland China and Taiwan, that line was kind of recognized by both sides that they would never cross it. Kind of like there's a median line in the East China Sea, and the Chinese Navy, up until about 2012, would never cross that median line with PLA combatants, naval warships, and the Japanese wouldn't go to the west. It was kind of a unwritten de facto line of separation.
Yes.
And it was clearly that way in the center line of the Taiwan Strait. And then this last year, China started crossing it. In fact, in the last week or two, a Chinese helicopter even crossed it, which was a first. So you've had
Yes.
bombers, you've had fighters, you've had helicopters, you've had statements that Taiwan is a renegade province and we can fly over it if they lip off too much to us, if they get too cocky, we can even fly over it. And now you have this PLA spokesman saying there is no center line. So I anticipate what you're going to see is closer and closer flights by the PLA towards Taiwan. They will routinely now cross that center line and even come up to 12 nautical miles. And then there'll be a big discussion about, well, there's no 12 nautical mile line because they're not a nation, and so we don't have to recognize 12. That will come as well. But right now, they're gonna make a big issue of crossing that center line, and this puts an
Okay.
incredible burden on Taiwan. I was in Taiwan in 2018 and 2019, and in one of my visits there, I believe it was in 2019, I spoke with Admiral Lee, who was the head of he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs for Taiwan's military, and I had a long conversation with him. But one of the things we discussed was an article that had been written by former Director of National Intelligence, U.S. Director of National Intelligence, and former Commander of U.S. Pacific Command, Admiral Blair. And he had written an article that recommended both Japan and Taiwan reconsider reacting to every Chinese or Russian, and for the Japanese, incursion into their ADIZ, because
Yes.
that was each government's policy. The policy of Taiwan was whenever there's a penetration of the air defense identification zone, the air forces of Taiwan have to respond and
Yes.
launch fighters to intercept and identify and be prepared to shoot down in the case of a conflict. And Blair's position is that doing that, by having such a policy, that the Chinese with the bigger air force can put more strain on a smaller air force like Taiwan and its pilots and its aviation assets that can make them degrade faster. Because as you know, every time you fly an aircraft, you record the hours that the engine has been flying and it's been operating. And each engine, each air wing, the route of the air wing, the wing into the empennage, all of those parts of a plane and a jet and a bomber, they have service life. They have a designed lifespan. And the designed lifespan is based upon estimated flight hours. And so the designers base the lifespan on, say, 10 hours a month. And now if the Chinese are constantly flying every day into your ADIZ, and your fighter now is flying 15 or 17 or 20 hours a month, that is now reducing the lifespan of that platform, which means Taiwan's going to have to purchase or
Mm-hmm.
acquire, uh, maintenance parts and equipment and pilots to keep up with the stress from the outside. So his recommendation was you shouldn't respond every time. I disagreed with Admiral Blair, and I said, instead of doing less and being unprepared and letting the Chinese come in and you not respond, what you need to do is focus on getting a larger Air Force. You need to ramp up your Air Force production. And that's hard to do because they purchase their aircraft from the United States. And so we kind of control that spigot. But my concern is if you don't respond every time, then the PRC and the PLA then go to school and learn about when it is that the Taiwan Air Force
Yes.
responds and doesn't respond. And then they create knowledge and understanding of their indications and warning system of the Taiwan Air Force. So it's a very tough problem. It can be alleviated if Taiwan were to just start massively producing more aircraft and also getting ground-based air defense systems for their Navy and their shore facilities, because you can track a lot of these Chinese fighters and bombers that come into the strait from your coastline, from Taiwan's coastline, and you can track them and have the anti-surface to air missiles that would put those platforms at risk. So I think that's the challenge that Taiwan's going to be facing, is this ever increasing PLA Air Force and PLA Naval Air Force incursions into the island, and from all vectors, not just from the mainland to the west coast of Taiwan, but now with aircraft carriers operating from the east of Taiwan, you're going to see fighters and bombers coming in from the east and from the
Oh.
south and from the north on a routine basis.
Okay, so my question is, it happens in many parts of the world that Chinese Navy uh, points lasers at Japanese aircraft or Taiwanese or US aircraft. Why doesn't anyone, let's say, point back? Why does everyone take it and doesn't respond? It's like only the Chinese can do it,
Right.
but they do
So
it
the
from
way,
time to time.
right. Gordon Chang, you probably know who Gordon Chang is. He's been probably the single most important voice in America for asking this exact question. And he's used a phrase and said, "This is a declaration of war when you point a laser at somebody.
Yes,
It's the same as shooting a missile or a gun in some sense, because the laser can blind the pilot and
yes,
then the aircraft can crash." There's some debate about even lasers can affect onboard flight systems, so that your navigation or even your propulsion systems could be affected. So you could effectively shoot down an aircraft with a laser. So it's very dangerous. But these China hands, these engagers, they don't ever talk about it because that would upset their engagement strategy. Kissinger is the father of the engagement school.
yes.
He always says we shouldn't highlight our differences. Don't talk about our differences in public. So that's why you don't hear a lot of discussion about the uh, you don't hear a lot of discussion about these lasing incidents. And then the Chinese foreign ministry comes out and says, you have no proof of it. So we didn't do that. It's a lie. And so it never has taken hold. And unfortunately, it's going to take, it shouldn't, but it probably will take some kind of crash or something before people get really serious about that. And that's too bad. I think right now, you know, I think people should be much more willing to say this is an aggressive act of war and we're going to treat it as such. And maybe that would get Beijing's attention.
So the West is just too civilized. They are the good guys, the good cop, and the Chinese are the bad cop, and they just refuse to respond, right? Until something happens.
Yeah, that's the way it appears, is that, we're playing by, the Marcus of Queensberry rules for boxing, and that, we're going to only obey these rules while we're fighting one of those MMA fighters there's no rules. He's going to kick you, punch you, bite you, hit you, do whatever it takes to win. And that's where the Chinese are. In many ways, it's for those for us that are Americans and know our history. When America was founded, the British, we called them the Redcoats, and they were obviously in America. It was a British colony, but the British Army, the Redcoats, they wore red coats and they marched in single file lines and they played by certain European rules for
Yes.
fighting. And the Americans were like, they didn't have any red coats and they hid behind trees and rocks and they wore camouflage, if you will, and they
Yes.
didn't play by those rules and they won. And it seems like it's flipped now, and the Chinese are willing to do these things to win, and we're not so much. Now, I say that in jest a bit because I know that our military people that are in uniform today, they do want to win, and they're trying to devise schemes and methods to fight to win. They want to win. Uh, my beef is not with the people in uniform. It's with the policymakers that haven't provided them the resources to do that, and so they're trying to make do with less and less to achieve a greater mission requirement.
Okay, so that's the last question, or maybe there would be another one. Preparations, like when I watched the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, what do you think does China and Taiwan learn from it? Because there are again some people who are saying, "Oh no, the conflict is less likely because China sees the Russian." But I think the opposite. They just keep learning, observing, and they tell themselves, "Oh, we are the Han people. We are superior, so we wouldn't make those mistakes. We have more money. We're just better." And I think it makes everything actually more likely because they can prepare for the economic sanctions. They can improve their military. They see again how the West reacts, and they're only better prepared. What's your
I,
take on that?
yeah, I agree with you. I think the people that say that this event and this invasion and murder by Putin in Ukraine is going to and the pushback by NATO and in America, that's taught China that they can't afford to invade Taiwan. I think that's a foolish thinking, for all the reasons that you said. This war is probably for Xi Jinping one of the greatest gifts he's ever gotten in terms of
Yes,
military preparedness, because he's able to study how the West responded. For instance, there's many in Washington that are patting themselves on the back with reports to say, we had a great intelligence success because we predicted they would invade and they
yeah,
invaded. And
yeah,
I say to people, that's a failure. That's an intelligence failure. You saw what was happening and you did nothing. So that's a lesson
yes,
that Xi's going to take, which is to say that you can even build up your military, but if you keep them guessing in Washington and Brussels and Tokyo, that nothing will be substantively prepared to defend. Secondly, um, what did Xi learn? One of the things he learned is Zelensky was able to stay alive and to stay active and to stay speaking to the world. That is something that President Tsai Ing-wen should be very, very worried about, because if China comes, the first thing they will do is they will find her and assassinate her and her high-level officials. And China has a fifth column in Taiwan. We know this,
yes,
that there's agents. Maybe
yes,
there were Russian agents in the Ukraine, but they weren't very effective. China will seek to make sure that their agents
yes,
are effective. Then they'll learn a lesson about quick how quick you are. Putin, for whatever reason, didn't really strike in what we in that kind of a very lightning bolt way. In the past, China has written Chinese military leaders, and I've spoke about this back in 2014 about a short, sharp war that was regarding the Japanese islands. But this idea that China studied what happened in 1990 with Desert Storm and the shock and awe campaign to take Iraq, the Chinese have been studying that now for over 30 years. And they talk about when we strike Taiwan, we have to be quick and we have to get all of our objectives quickly. And I think that's something that the Chinese already knew, but they will now have tactical and practical examples of how to where to go. What was it? What were the key elements of the Ukrainian defense structure that they didn't quickly decapitate and eliminate? And obviously, air power is one of them. Uh, the issues of tanks, not so important maybe in an island landing campaign, but the idea of these drones and the ability of drones that were used by the Ukrainians to defeat the invading forces, that's something that Xi and his team and the Central Military Commission have already been thinking about. Will have to get even more adept at. Will there be a drone on drone war as a Chinese invasion fleet after a joint fire strike campaign? So the Chinese already have a doctrine that says we're going to joint fire strike. We're going to fire in ballistic missiles, cruise missiles into Taiwan in a much more massive way than they did in the Ukraine. People say, well, China won't want to destroy, Taiwan. And I think at the point that China decides to go, they will make sure they destroy what needs to be destroyed. And they have many more missiles than
Yes.
does Russia, and a wide variety of missiles. And so they will bring in that joint fire strike campaign. Then they will establish a joint uh, air space control over Taiwan, and then they will launch that invasion. And maybe they have drones that come out in front of that to look for the drones that the Taiwans may still have to take out their drones. And then there's electronic warfare and cyber that didn't
Yes.
really come into effect before. Everyone expected that if Putin were to launch an invasion, that the first thing he would do is, you know, use the cyber capacities to take out infrastructure and communications and the ability for to create more fog in the fog of war. I think China will be able to do that even more, and at least they're learning that from this episode in the Ukraine. So there's a whole lot of things that the PLA and the Chinese Communist Party are researching, and I think we should expect that we should be studying this war from that perspective. Is what is it that they've learned, and then how can we, in a kind of a chess match, if they know if they learned a lesson and we know what that lesson is, and they've developed a counter, what is our counter to their counter?
Yes. Yeah, that's the difference between the civilians and military people, because I listened to an interview of General Spalding recently, and he said something to that extent that the PLA would just flatten Taiwan and turn US bases in Asia to dust. And he said they would just go all in. And he said the West has no idea how much weaponry China has.
I 100% agree with that.
So that's
This
another
idea that
surprise for
when
the
they go,
experts.
yeah, when they go, they will go full all the way. There won't be any
Yes.
pullback.
Yes. Okay, last question then. It's a little bit what if. So what can countries, let's say outside the region, do? Let's say my native Poland. What could we do to help alleviate or prevent a conflict?
In Asia, that's a difficult question, especially since and my great how do I say this? The people of Poland, they are very deeply have my respect for what they've done in this war in the Ukraine, and your taking of
Yes.
millions of Ukrainians into your country. You people of Poland are, in my mind, some of the most honorable people on the planet, and I have honor for the people of Poland. I really, it's just an honor to speak with you. I know you're from
Yes.
Poland.
Thank
I
you.
know your
Yes.
message goes to the people of Poland. So what they've done and how they've confronted Putin, you incredible, great bravery and great courage and great humanity to the people of the Ukraine, and to try to confront this madman Putin. So the question is, how does Poland help with something in Asia? Well, I think by continuing to keep Putin uh, engaged,
Okay.
because the more Putin is engaged with NATO and Poland and this wall that's now being built up like it was in the Cold War. Putin didn't want that, and he's now actually got it. And so I would suggest to Poland and to the NATO forces everything that we didn't do for the last 20 years in Eastern Europe. We were very
Yes.
reluctant to move Aegis ashore in. We were very reluctant to move THAAD, Theater High Area Air Defense. We were reluctant to move Patriot batteries. We were reluctant to move in ground forces. We should go all in now and move it all up to that border to remind Putin that he can't do anything. Now, there's some people that disagree with that and say we shouldn't be so confrontational with Russia because it drives him into the China camp. And I'm afraid that's too late. The Chinese and the Russians signed the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in 2005. So for 17 years, they've been working together. In 2018, the Russians invited the PLA to observe and participate in Vostok. That's a historic event. Vostok, as you all from Poland would know, there's this strategic level, nuclear level exercise that the Russians do. And they never invite anybody to observe from a foreign country. And the fact that they, in 2018, invited the PLA to be observers and participants shows the level of integration and trust. And then we've seen these, combined joint naval exercises in the
Yes.
Mediterranean, in the Sea of Japan, and the Yellow Sea. So their militaries are integrating. The leaders put out a statement at the Olympics of this cooperation.
Yes.
We're going to be friends forever. So I don't think we have to worry about driving Russia into China's hands. They're already
Okay.
there. So what we need to worry about is keeping them both engaged and, I'll use the word contained. We need to
Yes.
contain them and not let them think that they can just free range around without being observed. So I think that's the best thing that Poland practically can do today. Maybe in the long term, if Russia is really, really weakened through this failed adventure in the Ukraine, if they're depleted, then maybe Taiwan can help, send munitions to Taiwan. But I don't see that in the near term right now. I think you still got a
Yeah.
big tiger on your hands in the Russian military in the Ukraine.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Richard. Appreciate it, and all the best to you.
Thank you, Jim.